What if the most feared man in Boston wasn't just dodging the police, but quietly working with them? What if the mob boss everyone thought was untouchable was actually feeding information to the FBI from the shadows? Imagine a city where one name is enough to silence a room. A name that carries so much weight, people lower their voices without even realizing it. In The Departed, Jack Nicholson's Frank Costello represents that kind of dangerous myth. A crime lord who seems to know everything happening on both sides of the law. But what most people never realize is that Scorsese didn't pull this idea out of thin air. It's rooted in a real Boston gangster whose true story is even more disturbing than the fiction. Frank Costello was inspired heavily by James, Whitey Bulger, a man who didn't just dominate Boston's underworld. He operated for years through a secret, highly controversial relationship with the FBI, while the Winter Hill Gang was shaking down businesses, running drugs, and leaving behind a trail of bodies. Bulger was simultaneously providing information that the Bureau used against the Italian Mafia, not publicly, not proudly, and definitely not cleanly, but quietly, covertly, and in a way that blurred every ethical line the FBI claimed to stand for. And here's what makes it even crazier. The arrangement didn't weaken Bulger. It strengthened him. To understand how that happened, you need to go back to South Boston, Southie, where Bulger grew up. This wasn't a neighborhood you drifted through. Loyalty was the operating system. History mattered. Your last name mattered. And among the kids on the street, Bulger stood out early. He wasn't just feared for being violent. He was feared because he was calculated, controlled, and strangely charismatic. He understood power before he ever had it. By the time he rose to lead the Winter Hill Gang in the 1970s, he had already built a reputation for being both ruthless and disciplined. His crew dealt in extortion, bookmaking, drug trafficking, everything you'd expect from a major organized crime outfit. But the bigger Bulger grew, the more attention he attracted from law enforcement. And this is where one of the most notorious partnerships in modern American history began. The FBI agent assigned to tackle mafia activity in Boston was John Connolly, a man who, by chance, had grown up in the same South Boston projects as Bulger. Connolly saw Bulger not just as a criminal, but as someone with status, with neighborhood credibility, and with access to the kind of information the Bureau was desperate for. At the time, the FBI's top priority nationwide was dismantling the Italian-American Mafia, and Boston was no exception. That obsession opened the door for a dangerous deal. Bulger began supplying intelligence on the Patriarca crime family, the Italian Mafia, operating in New England. In theory, he was helping federal investigations. In practice, he was feeding the FBI exactly what helped them, while steering attention away from himself. Connolly protected him, updating him about investigations, warning him when things were heating up, and influencing internal reports to ensure Bulger stayed useful and therefore shielded. Legally, ethically, morally, this was a disaster waiting to happen. Bulger wasn't cooperating out of fear, or guilt, or some sense of civic duty. He was using the arrangement strategically. By pointing the Bureau toward rivals, he weakened the competition. By staying off their radar, he expanded his own power. Everyone else got pressure. He got room to grow. The FBI believed they were getting an invaluable source. Bulger believed he had federal insurance. And both sides were right, just not in the way anyone intended. As the years went on, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Other agencies wondered why the Winter Hill Gang seemed unusually lucky. Investigations into Bulger stalled or mysteriously collapsed. Raids hit everyone except him. Connolly defended Bulger so aggressively that even other agents started questioning the relationship. And yet, the partnership kept going. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't public. But for years, it worked. Until it didn't. By the early 1990s, outside investigators started digging deeper. A new prosecutor began reviewing old cases, connecting dots no one was supposed to connect. Documents surfaced. Reports once buried quietly re-emerged. And then the truth came out. For years, the FBI had been taking information from Bulger, while a small number of agents had been protecting him far beyond what the rules allowed. That revelation detonated the entire BSD Austin office. Connolly's career imploded. Internal investigations spread like wildfire, and the untouchable myth of Whitey Bulger finally cracked. With federal charges closing in, Bulger didn't wait for the inevitable. In late 1994, he disappeared completely, vanishing into a life on the run that would last roughly 16 years. 16 years hiding in apartments across the country under false identities until 2011. When he was finally captured in California at the age of 81, the man who once controlled Boston's underworld ended up spending his final years in prison, where he was ultimately killed in 2018 after being transferred to another facility at its core. This story isn't just about crime, it's about betrayal on every level. Bulger betrayed rivals by feeding their names to the FBI. Connolly betrayed the badge by shielding a violent criminal. And the system betrayed the public by letting the lines between informant and criminal dissolve into something no one could control. That's why Departed hit so hard. Not because of the fiction, but because of how close it sits to a truth the country is still reckoning with. A truth about what happens when law enforcement becomes so focused on one enemy that it accidentally empowers another. And in this case, the rat wasn't hiding in the walls. He was sitting across the table, shaking hands with the people who should have stopped him. If you want more deep dives into the real stories behind iconic films, check out the next video and hit subscribe.